of your participation and engagement on this issue. My name is John Colborn. I'm Executive Director of Apprenticeships for America. We have identified Workforce Pell as a significant opportunity for the expansion of apprenticeships in the United States, we think. Have been working over the last few weeks after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill to assess how apprenticeship programs might connect to Workforce Pell. And so what you're going to hear today is a little bit of a presentation on what we've learned in the last couple of weeks and some recommendations that we are proposing as we go into the rule-making process around Workforce Pell, which will be a significant process for this work. I just want to thank everyone for participating. A shout out to Jim Rosapep, who's been a huge booster of this idea and a source of incredible energy as we've been undergoing some of our reconnaissance around this work. Jim is on our board, also a state senator in Maryland, and is very much positioning Maryland to be able to take advantage of this opportunity. So thank you for that work, Jim. And then I just want to acknowledge all the AFA members who have joined this call and who are part of this conversation. We really appreciate your partnership and support, and more on that in just a little bit. Leading this conversation is going to be my colleague, Harry Leach, who's really taken the initiative to do a lot of the legwork in researching this topic. He's going to be presenting a couple of slides as we work our way through this, and then walking through some of the recommendations that we're going to be putting to the rule-making process. I think with that, I'm going to turn this over to Harry, and Freddie, I think you can get the slides up on the screen. Thanks.
Great, thanks, John, and hi, everyone. Great to see you here and see so much interest in Workforce Pell and apprenticeship. So I'm going to talk through a bit about what the legislation says, what's new, what the policy making process is going to look like, and then we'll get into how Workforce Pell fits with apprenticeship and the changes that we'll need to make both in policy and in practice to make it work. We've got quite a lot of content to go through, so I'll try and pause throughout for any questions and comments, but just feel free to put your hand up if you want to come in, or put a comment in the sidebar as we're going along, and we'll try and pick it up. So Freddie, if you could go to slide 3. Firstly, just a really quick recap of how traditional normal Pell works. So Pell Awards are federal grants to undergrads determined by financial needs. Students work out their eligibility through FAFSA forms. The maximum amount at the moment is $7,395 for a term. Pell's got a lifetime limit, so everyone is eligible for 12 terms or up to 6 years in total. And that funding goes to schools to pay tuition. If tuition's covered, it can also pay the student directly. Institutions that receive Pell funding have to be Title IV eligible, so those can be community colleges, trade schools, 4-year degrees, lots of different institutions in there, but they're recognised by the state and by accreditors and the education department. And just really quickly on the current figures, so around a third of undergrads receive Pell Awards, Pell Grants, and that's just over 30 billion a year currently. So going on to the next slide, what does Workforce Pell do? So simple form, it's a new form of Pell Award for short-term courses under 15 weeks. And it also allows you to receive Pell Awards for non-degree programs, for credentials other than degree. So eligible students and institutions are the same as for normal Pell. So eligibility is determined by financial status, and institutions need to be Title IV eligible. On the funding amounts, so how we've interpreted it is going to be a kind of prorated amount based on the existing current Pell Award. So we think the awards are going to be between around 1,000 and 5,000, depending on eligibility and depending on the length of the course. And then final figure, there's an estimate produced around the legislation that the additional spending from Workforce Pell is going to be around 300 million a year. So that would be an additional 100,000 learners. So that's based on an additional 100,000 learners. So that's kind of quite conservative. It would be about a 1% increase of total Pell funding. But as we'll get into, the program eligibility is fairly tight. So getting into program eligibility on the next slide. This is what the legislation sets out about which programs are eligible for Workforce Pell. So the first element on the left-hand side is about time. So to be eligible for Workforce Pell, a course or program needs to be between 150 and 600 block hours. And it also needs to last a minimum of 8 weeks and a maximum of 15. We'll go through how this applies to apprenticeship or how we think it applies a bit later. It also needs to be a program that's already in existence. So you can't kind of start a new program and immediately apply for Workforce Pell. It needs to have been offered by an eligible institution for a year prior to seeking eligibility for Workforce Pell. Then on the actual course itself, so firstly, it can't be a correspondence course. So there's actually quite a specific definition for that. So, the learning is learner-led at home. The institution, the provider is kind of sending materials, not much else. Interestingly, the legislation gives a really big role for states in determining program eligibility and gives them quite a lot of flexibility. So written into the legislation, governors need to determine these 4 points here on the slide, that the credentials aligned with the requirements of high skill or in-demand occupations, that it meets the hiring needs of potential employers, that it leads to a credential that is stackable and portable across multiple employers, or a kind of recognized credential that results in employment where there's only sort of one recognized credential in that occupation. And it prepares students to pursue certificates or degrees. So we're interpreting that as essentially it's awarding credit. Finally, there's on the right-hand side here, so there's a big focus on setting a high quality bar for eligible programs. So the program has to have a completion rate of 70% and a job placement rate of 70%. There's quite a complex calculation on the relationship between tuition and earnings, which I'll go into on the next slide. It might be a bit easier words. So the legislation sets out that the maximum tuition can't be more than the value added earnings of program participant. The way that's being worked out, we've tried to simplify it here, but I'm not sure it's that simple. So there's an equation in the middle, sorry, and then a kind of worked example, hypothetical example below. So they're taking the median earnings of completers 3 years prior. So people have done the course 3 years before, what they're earning today. Here in the bottom left, I've used some data on median earnings for apprentices, all apprentices in Washington State. This is actually just median earnings after 1 year. It's not easy to get the data 3 years after completion, which shows a potential issue we might face. You then apply a regional deflator to get a kind of comparable national figure. You then take away 150% of the federal poverty line for one person. So that gives you your maximum tuition. So in this case, for apprentices in Washington, you could charge a maximum tuition rate of around 35 grand based on those earning figures. I might pause there to see if there's any questions about eligibility, what the legislation says, and we'll get into kind of what it means for apprenticeship more directly later.
Harry, just a question in the chat about the 150 hours contact time. That's actual classroom instruction, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that is. I mean, what they say clock hours, I think, in the legislation. But yeah, that is actual instruction rather than broader study time.
Thanks. Any other comments? Yeah, any other comments, either in the chat or shout it out?
So on Josh's comment on does registered apprenticeship get a kind of automatic eligibility for Workforce Pell in the same way that it does for the GI Bill and WIOA? So I think at the moment, no, but that's, you know, something we should think about in specific bits of the rulemaking purpose. Great. Just getting on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I might just try and pick up a few more questions. So Vinny's question, is it still restricted to non-bachelor degree holders? I'm fairly sure it's not, actually. So you can't be currently studying for a degree, because then you'd be eligible for your normal full-time Pell. But as long as you haven't exhausted your lifetime limit for Pell awards, I think you can still be eligible. And then Jennifer's question, does the legislation mandate the source of data for those median earnings? It does not. And I think data is probably going to be a big part of what's picked up in the rulemaking process, as lots of that is probably going to be easier to source at the state level rather than federally. Freddie, can we go on to the next slide, please? Great. So we wanted to talk a bit about the rulemaking process and what that's going to look like. So the bill sets out funding should be available by July 2026. So just under a year from now, and there's a lot that needs to happen between now and then to get this into operation. So right now, the Department for Education is establishing what's called a negotiated rulemaking. There's actually two committees. One, the RISE committee, is dealing with changes to, you know, broader federal student loan changes. And then the one we care about that's going to make determinations on Workforce Pell is called the AHEAD committee. The department are accepting written comments and nominations for the committee until the 25th of August. So just under a week's time. So we'll be putting in some comments based on this webinar, which we'll share. We'll be making some nominations for the committee as well. That committee will meet in December and January and discuss and come up with language for a proposed rulemaking. So we think that they're particularly going to be focusing on these questions about program eligibility. There's one quirk of how these processes work for education. So if the committee reaches consensus, the department needs to accept that language that gets into the proposed rules. But if there's not consensus on the committee, the department can just push ahead and proceed with its own position. After those committees meet, then there'll be an OMB process, and then the department will publish an NPRM, the proposed rule, and then publish final regulations on Workforce Pell. So that's a federal process over the next kind of 7-8 months or so. There's also, as legislation make clear, there's a big role for states. So we also expect states are going to be thinking at the same time about how they're going to make their determinations about program eligibility. They don't have to, but states could also choose to legislate to set out how this process is going to work. Any questions about that process, the rulemaking process in the committee? John, if you could keep an eye on the sidebar and pull out anything.
Definitely doing that and trying to be responsive to some of the specific questions that are coming up here. But if we're not being responsive, raise the question again so we can get to it. Thank you.
Cool. Brad just asked a question on tight timeline. Is it likely to be enacted? I think good question. There's a lot that needs to happen before now and then. I think we'd expect there will be rules in place. There will be a proposed structure in place, but there's a lot of work for states and there's a lot of work for providers, after those rules come out to work out how it's going to work, where they're going to get the data from. Great. Okay, on to how this interacts with apprenticeships. So Freddie, if you can go to the next slide, please. Slide 9. So we should have maybe started with the kind of, why are we talking about this? The first point, to be really upfront, the legislation doesn't mention apprenticeship. It's not designed specifically with apprenticeship in mind. But we think apprenticeships fit really well with the intention of the bill. If you think about, all that language on program eligibility, we're really trying to target funding, get funding to courses that are very employer focused, that lead to high skill, high demand jobs, meet hiring requirements. Apprenticeships fits really well with all those specifications. We haven't come across many apprenticeship programs that are using existing Pell Awards. There's a few apprenticeship degree programs that are able to access it, but not many. Interested to hear if people on the call have managed to or tried to access normal Pell for apprenticeship. So there's a lot that's going to be new here for apprenticeship programs. The whole interaction with the student finance system is going to be a whole new thing. But we think with the right design, Workforce Pell is as a demand-led source of funding could be a real opportunity for apprenticeship programs. I think we're talking about a specific segment of the apprenticeship market. We're talking about using Workforce Pell to fund related instruction. We're not talking about trying to fund on-the-job learning or wages or anything like that. It's targeted at related instruction. And we're talking about where that instruction is taking place in a Title IV eligible provider, like a community college. So I'm going to talk about program eligibility and how we think that translates across to apprenticeship. So on the next slide, firstly, the easy stuff. So these are the things, in the legislation that we think will work really well with apprenticeship. Not going to go through them all because we think these aren't barriers. We don't need to consider rulemaking changes or practice changes. For example, a job placement rate of 70%. In theory, apprenticeships should have a job placement rate of 100%. You're already working in your apprenticeship. You already have a job. From the figures we went through earlier, that value added earnings calculation, we're fairly confident that the kind of tuition that you need to charge for apprenticeship RI is going to be lower than that value added earnings calculation. So these things we think all good, all fine, don't need to worry about. On to the next slide. So these are the things that we think are going to be a little bit more challenging to marry the requirements of Workforce Pell together with what's out in the legislation. So these are kind of requirements that are specifically in the legislation going to be fundamental to Workforce Pell. That may be more difficult to apprenticeship programs, require specific allowances for apprenticeships or changes in practice. Red might have been a bit harsh as a color scheme here. These aren't insurmountable. We think there are plenty of solutions. But just to talk through these. So firstly, kind of an obvious point is you need a tuition structure to be able to access student finance. You need a fee that you can pay with that award. Traditionally, apprenticeships don't tend to use tuition. The learner doesn't pay. That's a great part of the beauty of the model. So that is going to be a change and something different and quite fundamental. Secondly, on the time requirement. So we have this hours requirement, but we also have a minimum and maximum length of course, minimum of 8 weeks, maximum of 15. So remember, if we're just talking about related instruction here rather than the whole apprenticeship, it's feasible to have a front-loaded program. So while most apprenticeships won't structure their AI over the course of the apprenticeship, that's going to be longer than 15 weeks. We think completion rates is going to be another challenge. So I think there was a question earlier, is that a blanket 70% across all industries? All the legislation says is a completion rate of 70% within 150% of normal program time. There's going to have to be some deliberation by states and colleges working out exactly how they make the calculation, but it appears that it is a blanket rate. We think the national apprenticeship completion rate is around 45%. There's going to be some programs that are, 80, 90%, but overall hitting that 70% completion rate is going to be a challenge. It's worth pointing out, part of the motivation for having a high completion rate is you don't want students who are, walking away without a credential with lots of debt. That's not the case in apprenticeships as they currently exist. Apprentices who aren't complete don't have any debt. They're often leaving because they've got a better paid job or because they realize that occupation just isn't right for them. Fourth one here on meeting general Pell eligibility requirements. So we don't have a kind of particularly scientific way of calculating it, but anecdotally, we think most apprentices are likely to meet the sort of income and financial need requirements. But the issue is likely to be that the wages you receive as an apprentice will count against your calculation on student aid, so it'll bring down how much Pell you're eligible for because you're earning while you're in the classroom. Final one, we talked earlier about this requirement that the course is offered at least 1 year prior to eligibility for Pell, for Workforce Pell. So this is obviously a problem, for new programs. You couldn't set up an apprenticeship and immediately apply for Pell. There's going to be a kind of bridging capital issue for that first year. We think there's ways around that. We've got question marks. It's not clear, where older programs would count. Would an existing registered apprenticeship that doesn't charge tuition, isn't sort of within the student finance world, isn't on a college's course offer, would that count? We don't know yet. So that's an area of concern. On to the next slide. So these are some issues we've identified where we've talked to, the experts on student finance. We've looked at some broader existing regulations and guidance around student finance. These aren't necessarily, 100% going to be issues for apprenticeship, but they're not explicitly in the legislation on Workforce Pell, but they're issues that could come up that we want to make sure that we've got a position. The first is how job placements are defined, which you'd think would be quite simple. It turns out there's apparently only over 15 different definitions between accreditors and states of what a job placement is. So the education department doesn't define a job placement, but accreditors and states do. So our worry is, it might counterproductively be quite easy to come up with a definition that doesn't count an apprenticeship as a job. So an example is sometimes programs have used a definition where the job has to be different to the one the learner had going into the program. So you can kind of prove that the program and the education has actually had an impact. Obviously, that wouldn't work in the apprenticeship structure. Secondly, funding amounts. So we talked earlier about the awards being between 1,000 and 5,000 roughly, depending on course length and the learner's financial need. We think this is probably pretty reasonable to cover RI costs for most programs. Most programs will probably be within these limits for their related instruction, but interested in people's reflections about whether this stacks up, would this cover your RI costs? The third point here, this is actually another new addition in the Big Beautiful Bill, and it sets out that you're not eligible for federal Pell Awards if you've got a non-federal source of funding, so state funding, philanthropic, or private if the employer is covering it. So if that funding already covers your tuition, you're not eligible for Pell. So we think there's an issue here about how the majority of apprenticeship programs now, this activity is going to be funded by the employer. So we think there's an issue about how workforce pay and employer funding will interact, that we need to have a position on. FAFSA left this quite broad, but we just think it's worth noting, FAFSA applications are going to be completely new for apprenticeships and may present some challenges. The issue that we're circling around is the kind of whether apprentices are considered independent or dependent. So anyone over 25 for the purposes of FAFSA is considered independent. So then you wouldn't include parental income on your FAFSA form. That will be the majority of apprentices currently. The average age is about 29. But apprentices under 25 at the moment, they will be considered as dependent. They need to also provide parental income, which could limit their eligibility. The next one is a bit of a complex one. So there's guidance with current Pell Awards that where your instruction is being provided outside of the Title IV institution, either at kind of, an ineligible provider, maybe like a private training provider, or if it's an employer, you need to have a written agreement with that employer setting out how it's going to work. And there's also a limit on how much instruction can take place outside of the Title IV eligible institution. So that's set at 25% or less, or up to 50% with the permission of the accreditor. Depending how it gets interpreted in this rulemaking process, we think this could be a problem for an apprenticeship if you're counting your on-the-job component here. That's obviously going to be over, your on-the-job learning is going to be over 50%. Last couple potential issues, open enrollment. So there's kind of general provisions that colleges need to have an open enrollment policy for programs that are eligible for financial student aid. So that just means anyone can apply. The course is open on the kind of, college's course list, anyone can apply. We think there could be a potential issue here with apprenticeships, depending how the apprenticeship is set up. That could not be the case. It could only be open to incumbent workers, especially if you think about like a single employer program, you're kind of limiting who can access that. And final one here, just on data, this is just a general point. There's going to be a lot of data points that a provider needs to prove on completion rates, earnings, job placements. And that data is not easily available. It might be some challenges, especially providing kind of historic data on existing courses to prove those points. Okay, that was a lot. I'll pause there, pick up any questions about those potential challenges before we get into talking about solutions. Does anyone want to come in with any questions or comments?
Harry,
Are there any issues?
very, very active chat box going here, and certainly I've been interacting with it. But I would encourage anyone who feels like you hadn't got your question answered to raise it verbally now. And if you can use the hand raise feature, that's great. But if you can't figure that out, just jump in. Any questions? Okay, maybe we should proceed, Harry.
Cool. Looks like you've been very actively picking them up. Okay, great. So we thought about some solutions that address these issues. So some of these in the middle column are things that we think need to be addressed in the rulemaking, in regulations, where we need some clarity from the department. Some of them, the third column, are going to be about how colleges and providers structure their programs. So they're going to be practice changes. On the tuition side, the fact that we're just going to need a tuition structure to make apprenticeships eligible as workforce Pell programs. We think, this is a practice solution. Colleges will need to find a way to have tuition structures for related instruction that in itself hopefully isn't too complex. Providers know how to kind of set rates and charge tuition. The complex bit is really the arrangement for your non-Pell eligible student. We wouldn't want to kind of inadvertently end up charging the learner for apprenticeships when that's kind of the beauty of the model. That's not something that we want to kind of accidentally introduce through the back door. So we think there's a lot of questions here about how states structure their funding, how colleges structure their relationships with employers and bring in employer funding to kind of like strategically prioritize where that funding is going. On the length of time, so on this kind of minimum maximum of 15 weeks, we think the solution here for apprenticeships is firstly to use the clock hours requirement, so that 150 to 600 hours, as the sort of primary mechanism for calculating the tuition and calculating the amount of a Pell Award that you receive. And then secondly, what we'd like to suggest in the rulemaking process is that for apprenticeship RI, because of the kind of distinct structure, that it's counted as non-continuous. So you essentially start and stop the clock when you're in the classroom. You're only counting related instruction. You're not counting the rest of the apprenticeship. We think there's some precedent here. There's similar competency-based programs where there's on-the-job elements where the kind of regulatory structures are non-continuous in this way. So we think that's an area where you need a kind of exemption or like special treatment for apprenticeship because of the unique way that it's structured. There's also a potential solution on the practice side. You can just apply for multiple Workforce Pell Awards. Say you had a program, you could structure it in a way that RI is delivered in 2 chunks that are under 15 weeks and apply for 2 awards. That would also be feasible in the way that Pell is awarded and works. On completion rates, so our thinking here is, well, the goal is to make apprenticeships equitable, get equitable treatment with other similar credentials that are going to be eligible for Workforce Pell. So what we'd like to suggest again is that you count completion as a completion of RI rather than the completion of the whole program. So you're just looking at that kind of classroom basis. As a practitioner, there's also a few ways to make this work that we think would, well, in theory, would lead to a higher completion rate than a whole apprenticeship. So we've heard of some programs where the apprentice doesn't kind of formally start the program, the training, the RI, until they've been in the job for a few months. So by that point, they're more likely to stay. They know what the job entails. Also on the kind of college side, from a college, they could also, for the purposes of just showing that the 70% completion rate, if they have an apprenticeship that's attached to another credential, you can use a completion rate for that. So say you have an apprenticeship where you end up with an AD at the end, you can use your completion rate for ADs to show that kind of data point. On Pell eligibility and the interaction with apprenticeship wages. So our ask in the rulemaking process is to discount apprenticeship wages completely from that calculation. There's a precedent here. So federal work study is treated in this way. You don't need to count your federal work study wages as part of your kind of student financial need determination. So we think there's a good case to treat apprenticeships the same way. And then on existing for 1 year prior to applying for eligibility, fairly straightforward one. We think we should draw on existing regulation. If an apprenticeship program is already registered with DOL or with a state, if it's been in existence for at least a year, then that should count towards that bar of being offered for at least a year before. I will pause there. Any questions? Any thoughts on those? Any other complexities that we're missing? Josh.
just on that last thing you said about the year, I'd advocate for an even stronger position on that to say, just like GI Bill and WIOA eligibility, that something that is a registered apprenticeship program should get automatic eligibility, because it's going through the whole registration process and vetting and all that kind of stuff. I don't, like you said, they didn't write this about apprenticeship, so they might not have even been thinking about that, but that carve out already exists in multiple other, federal funding streams. There's no reason not to apply it here. Otherwise, you've got a conflict then, right? If it's eligible, why would it be eligible for those other two federal funding streams immediately if you registered an apprenticeship program, but then you got to wait a year before you could access this one? That's odd.
Yeah, agree. That's a great point. I mean, there's like a higher level point that covers a couple of the requirements here. That is, we've got a case to ask for automatic eligibility for registered apprenticeship programs because they're already registered another way and in the same way as that happens with GI Bill and we are. Andrew. Andrew, do you want to come in?
Thanks. Yeah. So would an apprenticeship program that's 16 or more weeks or 151 or more hours already be eligible under standard Pell without all of these, without needing to wait for the rulemaking and without all these potential differences?
If it led to a degree, it would.
And so for these programs, though, they also need to lead to a degree.
So what the legislation says is it needs to lead to a credential or a degree. So it needs to be credit bearing. So what we're thinking is, colleges can either tie RI to an existing credential, or they it's possible right now to award credit towards a degree for your RI. So we don't think that's going to be a challenge for practitioners. They're already doing this. Zach, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of what Josh was talking about, is making the eligibility simplified for registered apprenticeship programs. I think that's going to be the most important. Among the other opportunities for federal funds, whether that's WIOA or GI Bill or federal work study, they're all pretty complicated. So I think what the rule really needs to do is just ensure that apprenticeship programs can apply in a streamlined fashion and then be approved for a certain period of time if they meet that 70% completion rate, with some verification by the Department of Education that they meet that eligibility metric.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, completely agree. There's a whole host of issues that can be solved under one bucket if you make sure that you use your existing regulatory approach in apprenticeship rather than having that and then adding on a whole other, education regulation layer onto it. Okay, great. Let's go on to the next slide, please. And just run through a few of these other kind of slightly more speculative issues that may or may not come up in the regulations as they're being worked up. So I mentioned definition of a job placement earlier. It's unlikely that the department's going to set out clearly what a job placement is, but what we'd like them to signal to accreditors is that continuing employment in an apprenticeship should be counted as a job placement. That is a job. If there is a more sophisticated definition of a job placement that comes up in the rulemaking process, or maybe that happens at the state level, I think our preference is, that should be defined as a recognized occupation in the area that they were trained. That it's the same occupation as the training, which would work well for apprenticeships. How Pell interacts with other funding and the relationship between employer assistance and a Pell award. So I think we'd argue from a kind of advocacy perspective that employer assistance should be counted as the last money in. You know, if government's aim is to grow apprenticeships, you're only going to achieve impact with this if this is additive rather than kind of substituting for existing funding. But we also think, you know, this is an area, this sort of interaction with other funding is an area that states and institutions are just, they're going to have to be strategic about how they allocate their funding and where that employer assistance comes in to be able to kind of maximize how they can benefit from Workforce Pell. On FAFSA and this question of independent versus dependent students, you know, counting parental income, I think this might be quite tricky because it would have, you know, knock on effects on the students, other determinations. I think we'd like to suggest that apprenticeship is added, you know, some clarification on how to treat apprenticeships is added into the student aid handbook, and that is made a professional judgment exemption that a financial aid officer can make. So you can take a determination that an apprentice under 25 is counted as independent for the purpose of making that kind of financial need calculation. Program participation agreements. I think I didn't mention this earlier, actually. So this is, you know, a Title IV eligible institution gets approved by the state and education department and accreditors, and then it has a written program participation agreement between those parties that basically sets out what are the programs that are eligible for federal student aid. Similar to the point, you know, right now, very few apprenticeship programs are going to be written into those because they won't treat them, they might not treat them as credit bearing, but in most cases, they're not going to be looking for federal student aid. So they won't be listed in those agreements. Similar to the point that Zach and Josh were making, we think this is an area where apprenticeships need a kind of automatic exemptions, you know, similar to the WIOA ETPL list. Registered apprenticeships should be automatically added to those agreements. And then this question on kind of, you know, training in partner institutions outside of the eligible provider. Firstly, on written agreements, same point that we've been making. Let's use the existing paperwork. We don't need to add to that. Let's use existing apprenticeship standards as a written arrangement for apprenticeship for the purposes of Workforce Pell rather than adding another process. On the kind of, you know, limits, less than 25% or up to 50% of instruction outside, we think it's really important here that the rulemaking makes it clear that, you know, what we're looking at is purely the related instruction element of apprenticeship. You're not trying to use Workforce Pell to fund anything outside that, so you don't have to you know, meet those requirements for on the job training. And then open enrollment. So we think, again, there's probably a practice fix here. It's about the way that colleges can structure their program. So in the circumstances where that might be an issue, so you have a single employer apprenticeship, a college is running related instruction, has a course where only those employees of that employer can access it. What a college could do is just add a comparable course to their roster and have that open to everyone. So you meet those open enrollment requirements. Okay, I'll pause there. Any questions and thoughts on any of those?
I'm wondering if there's anyone on the call who works in a financial aid office or has a lot of interactions with a financial aid office who might be able to opine on, you know, any of this. We know that there is extraordinary complexity around administering financial aid. And this would, and many of our recommendations here are going to interact with that system. So we're very interested in any feedback, reactions, thoughts that folks who have that experience have. If anyone on the call who has got that background?
Hey, John, this is Adriana from Bloomboard. I don't particularly because I'm not the one who works directly with our university partners. But if you shoot me an email after this call, I can connect you to our folks who do. And they probably have some really significant insight into how this plays out with our current apprentices, as well as how it might be better moving forward.
Really appreciate that. Thank you, Adriana. Yeah, this is an area of regulation that we know apprenticeship regulation really well. This is an area of regulation we are learning a lot on, so appreciate that. Anybody else have a similar offer that they might be able to make, or any reactions to what they're seeing here?
Yes, I hesitate to respond, but I need to. I serve as a financial aid specialist with the State Department of Career Tech in Oklahoma. My role is support for the 29 technology centers across our state. We are clock hour only. Hence, we're gainful employment. Regulations apply to us, certificate only, non-degree. So we have been working diligently to attempt to make a regular program eligible that includes an apprenticeship. And it truly is that threshold of offsite instruction with a non-institutional instructor. That so when I looked at the non-continuous enrollment as an option, that was kind of the aha for us. Looking at some of that in that standpoint, that threshold is really the most difficult part. How do you exclude the on-site apprenticeship and still have it be a program that completes within a standard amount of expected time? That gets to be that complication. So I can shed some light there.
Incredibly helpful, and we'll follow up with you, Sandra. Appreciate the offer.
If I could jump in, I'm Mary Saris from Massachusetts. And as I listen to this and understand, I'm on the WIOA side, but we're also an apprentice sponsor. So we have experience on both sides of the equation. And in our apprentice work, we have always given the employer the final say in the RTI. And because we believe that's the key to keeping employers interested in being apprentice sites. And I just want to make sure that we don't water that down with all these rules and regulations that we're discussing here, because we will be accepting directly federal money to pay for some of the RTI. And that is a little concern of mine as we're in the middle of this conversation. I don't know if anybody else has that concern, but I think we have to remember that this is an employer-driven program, and we have to respect that. And there may be courses, and we've intimated that during the conversation, that wouldn't make a course Pell eligible, and therefore might not work under this new environment. Does that make sense?
Mary, I so appreciate your caution here, and that we not try to twist ourselves in knots and get away from what makes apprenticeship such a strong model, just to get at this funding. So I really, really appreciate that. And I think, somebody asked the question, and we have no way of knowing at this stage, what % of registered apprenticeship might find themselves in a position to take advantage of Workforce Pell. And you know, at this stage, I don't think it's a majority of apprenticeship programs. I think that's just the reality of sort of where we are right now. But I really appreciate your cautions on this. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Other comments? First off, thank you to everyone who put yourself forward. We've been taking down your names. Who put yourself forward to be an informant for us, somebody who might know just a little bit more about student financial aid than we do. So thank you for that. We have really benefited from from a very steep learning curve we've been going up over the last couple of weeks, and know we would continue to benefit from your guidance on this. So thank you. Vinny, speaking of somebody who put themselves out, Vinny, please.
Hi, yes, so I am Vinny Vincent Dunn. I am the Senior Director of Financial Aid and Registered Apprenticeship Programs at Reach University. And we are currently offering 2 registered apprenticeship degree programs for teacher certification, teacher prep, both result in a bachelor's degree. We also are currently launching our associate degree, which will also be a registered apprenticeship degree program. Our only kind of question with Workforce Pell that I am currently exploring, we do currently have 5 short-term certificate programs. They're ultimately designed for individuals that already have their bachelor's degree, but it's not in teaching. And so we do offer 5 different certificates where they could get their certification in teaching. That is the kicker, which is why I was asking earlier if anyone knew whether or not Workforce Pell, when you think of like, the general Pell Grant eligibility, if you've already earned your bachelor's degree, you're out. Like you're done. You can't access Pell after that, with one exception of post-baccalaureate degree programs for like transition to teaching programs, but that's even restricted for universities or colleges that may offer a transition to teaching program, but don't otherwise offer a bachelor degree program in teaching. And so like for us, we couldn't do the transition to teaching because we offered 2 teaching degree programs. But with this Workforce Pell, the question is, okay, great, we've got people that could come in and do any one of our 5 short-term certificate programs. However, they would have already had a bachelor's, and under normal Pell rules, you don't get Pell. Like once you have your bachelor's, you're done. And so that's where I didn't know if any of this Workforce Pell, if there was a written exemption of like, unlike the normal Pell, you could have a bachelor's to get access Pell, or like to access the Workforce Pell. So that's kind of where we're at right now in that exploration. I actually met with my boss yesterday and we talked about this in our one-on-one meeting. And that was the good chunk of our time, was trying to sift through and work out the logistics of Workforce Pell, because for us, our short-term programs, if you already have a bachelor's and you're not allowed to get the Workforce Pell, then we can't access it. Like then we wouldn't be able to even offer any sort of Workforce Pell kind of program. But if there's an exemption for that, then that would open the door for us to offer our 5 programs.
Harry, any reaction to that?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Vinny. So I actually just checked in the legislation on the background, and the language in there is if you already have a graduate credential, you're ineligible for Workforce Pell. So that's slightly different language, but I would take that to mean if you've already got a bachelor's degree, you're ineligible. But it's something we should triple check.
Thanks for that. Jim.
Hi there. We have not gotten to the slide on the states yet, right?
That's the next slide, Jim.
Okay, I want to comment on that once you do the briefing on it. That's all.
Cool. Shall I do that now?
Yeah, yeah, we should do that before we run out of time. Thanks.
Yeah, so Fred, if you could just skip to the last slide. So we've concentrated today on what's needed in the federal rulemaking to make this work for apprenticeship, but that's only a part of the process. There's going to be a huge amount of state activity in making this work. So states are going to be setting out how they'll consider program eligibility. The bill specifies, that's down to the governor's determination. So states will be producing guidance, or they could be legislating. There's also broader questions that states are going to be dealing with. So, for example, they could be quite directive with their community college systems on how they use Workforce Pell. They could go so far as encouraging the use of it for apprenticeships. And they're going to need to think about, there's a broader funding angle. They're going to need to think about, how do they use state funding to meet needs that Workforce Pell doesn't cover. There's also really important data questions where, the data for earnings, things like that, is going to be more easily accessible at the state level than at the federal level. So yeah, we're going to be trying to track what's going on at the state level as well as the federal process here. But Jim, I'll let you come in and have the last word on this.
Get my thing on here. There we go. Yes. Okay, great. Well, thank you. As John mentioned, I'm a state legislator in Maryland, as well as being on the A4A board. And we have already had a series of meetings in the state with our governor's office, with our labor department, with our higher education commission and other folks, our CT committee, to figure out how we're going to do this in Maryland. And I'm not saying we have the answer, but the point I want to make to everybody, because you all are from different places, is we at AFA are going to be looking at how states can make this work for them. And there was a question earlier about, is there going to be a transparent process by the governors as to how they do this? I'm sure it'll vary state by state. I have no idea. But I think the key point here is, if you're really interested in this, you need to focus on getting the state policy you want, not waiting for them to give you the policy. And we'll help you with that. But being proactive, I think, is the name of the game. As Harry said, the states have a lot of power. Specifically, the most important one is they have to approve the programs. The institutions are Title IV institutions. That's in the law. But a state could say, we're not going to approve any programs. Or a state could say, we'll only approve programs which are apprenticeship friendly. So the states have a lot of power here. And it's important, I think, that those of us who want to get this money for apprenticeships think about how to lobby for this apprenticeship friendly state policies on Workforce Pell. That was the only point I wanted to make.
Brilliant.
And that's a great point to end on, Jim. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar. This is clearly an issue that we're going to be continuing to track. So we're only at the very beginning of the policy making efforts around Workforce Pell. We'll continue to stay on top of it. As with our previous webinars, we'll be hanging out a little bit after the end of the webinar for our after chat. So feel free to hang out if you've got a question that didn't get answered or just want to share some latest gossip from the field. We're always happy to hear that. Otherwise, thank you very, very much, everyone. Be sure to check out the events page on the Apprenticeships for America website. We have many upcoming webinars. And I want to just announce some breaking news that we have a hold the date announcement out for our Apprenticeship Summit happening next year in Washington, D.C., May 18th through 20th. Put a hold on your calendars and more details coming soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.